My name is Arya, and I am 28 years old. Today I want to share a deeply personal story about a significant mistake that cost me everything. I'm not telling this story to seek sympathy or forgiveness, but to encourage anyone who might be in a similar situation to pause and make a change before it's too late. This is a story of vulnerability, poor decisions, and irreversible consequences. My hope is that my experience can serve as a lesson for others so they can avoid the same pitfalls. I lived a modest life as an office worker in Mumbai, employed at a small media company. While it wasn't my dream job, it provided me with enough security to support my little family. My husband, Dev, was a kind, devoted man who genuinely cared for me. Despite his unwavering support, I began to feel trapped in the monotony of daily life. Every day felt dull, repetitive, and lifeless. Then came the turning point in my life, the arrival of Vikram, my new manager. Vikram was everything my life seemed to lack: charming, confident, witty, and mysterious. His very presence captivated me in a way I couldn't explain. At first, our interactions were strictly professional, limited to brief work-related exchanges and casual comments. However, Vikram had a unique ability to make people feel valued and important. His compliments, although subtle, felt deeply personal. He noticed things no one else did: how I managed a difficult situation at work, the meticulous details in my reports, even the color of my clothes on any given day. "Arya, you're really good at this," he'd say in a soft yet sincere tone. These words, simple as they were, became my solace in the middle of long and tiring workdays. Initially, I dismissed them as polite managerial gestures, but they began to mean more to me as time went on. Slowly, I found myself looking forward to his presence and those fleeting moments of connection, which felt like a breath of fresh air in my otherwise suffocating routine. Over time, our interactions extended beyond the boundaries of the office. Late-night text messages began innocently, with questions about work, but they soon shifted to personal topics. We started discussing our passions, childhood memories, and thoughts we had never shared with anyone else. His messages carried an unspoken warmth that stirred something within me. "Are you feeling tired today? You did such a great job," or "It's rare to meet someone who understands so much," he'd write. Reading those texts in the quiet of the night, I felt emotions I couldn't name, a mix of excitement, guilt, and a sense of danger. Deep down, I knew I was walking a perilous path, but I didn't have the strength to stop. What started as innocent conversations soon evolved into something deeper. Vikram and I began spending time together outside of work. Our first meetings were in small, tucked-away cafes where we could talk without fear of being noticed. He always arrived first, ordering 2 coffees and greeting me with his trademark smile. We'd sit for hours, discussing our unfulfilled dreams and the simple joys of life, or sometimes saying nothing at all, just enjoying each other's company. Lunch dates turned into longer meals at cozy restaurants, where the soft lighting and intimate atmosphere made our conversations feel even more private. Vikram's gestures, like pulling out my chair or gently placing his hand on my shoulder, made me feel cared for in a way I hadn't experienced in years. One day, he invited me to his newly rented flat, describing it as a peaceful retreat from the city's chaos. At first, I hesitated, but his gentle persuasion and my own curiosity led me to accept. His apartment was modest but warm, with large windows that overlooked the city skyline. The dim yellow light and soft music playing in the background created an intimate setting. As we sat on the sofa, sipping wine and talking, I convinced myself that this was just a harmless escape from my dull life. But every glance, every touch, and every moment with Vikram pushed me further down a path I couldn't turn back from. The excitement and intensity of our connection blinded me to the consequences. I stopped thinking about the future or the impact of my actions, focusing only on the present and the emotions I didn't want to lose, even for a second. I became reckless. I didn't bother to hide the messages from Vikram on my phone, believing they were too vague for anyone to decipher. But each one told a story I wasn't ready to admit. My phone would buzz with a message from him while I sat beside Dev in the living room. "I miss you," the screen would read, and my heart would freeze for a moment. I quickly dismissed it as a work email when Dev glanced at me, but his eyes began to fill with doubt. Soon, my late nights at work and excuses about urgent meetings became frequent. Dev didn't question me outright, but I could sense his growing suspicion. I noticed the sadness in his eyes, a quiet melancholy that hadn't been there before. He would stand by the window, staring into the night with an expression I couldn't ignore. Despite all the signs, I didn't stop. My actions, fueled by an intoxicating mix of excitement and overconfidence, set me on a course toward irreversible loss. What started as a seemingly harmless distraction ultimately shattered the life I once held dear. Dinner that evening was unusually quiet. Dev sat across from me, his usual warmth replaced by a distant, introspective silence. While he still asked about my day, his questions were short and impersonal, lacking the curiosity they once held. It felt as though he no longer trusted my answers, unsure if what I said was the truth. The space between us grew, starting as a subtle gap and slowly widening into an undeniable chasm. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that Dev would never discover the truth, but deep down, I knew he sensed something was amiss. His uncertain, disappointed glances felt like a silent warning, but instead of heeding it, I chose to ignore it, continuing down my path of mistakes and convincing myself that the consequences were inevitable. One day, while sitting at my desk at work, an uneasy atmosphere seemed to settle around me. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, attributing it to the usual stress of the day. But then, the furtive glances began, co-workers stealing curious and judgmental looks in my direction. Murmurs turned into whispers, and whispers evolved into conversations that ceased the moment I entered a room. When I stepped into the pantry for a cup of tea, a group of colleagues standing nearby fell silent, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. They quickly turned away, pretending not to notice me, though their knowing smiles betrayed their attempts at subtlety. I stood there, heart pounding, as the weight of their judgment pressed heavily on me. Back at my desk, my phone buzzed with a text from a close coworker. "You should know someone saw you with Vikram." "They have photos." My heart sank as I opened the message, my hands trembling. Staring back at me was a clear image of myself entering Vikram's flat, the light from the doorway illuminating my face. Panic washed over me as I glanced around the office, feeling as though everyone was watching, yet no one said a word. The rumors spread rapidly, creating an oppressive tension in the air. Every step I took felt like walking through an invisible courtroom, with everyone playing the role of judge, their stares and whispers acting as my silent sentence. Despite my attempts to maintain composure, my mind raced with questions. Who took the photo? Who shared it? And how could I possibly escape this nightmare? The quiet laughter and murmurs from across the office made me feel smaller and more isolated than ever. I knew that the moment that photo circulated, my life would never be the same. When the call came from my boss's office, dread settled deep in my chest. I stood, trying to appear calm, but the fear coursing through me was overwhelming. As I entered the room, the cold stare of my boss froze me in place. Vikram was already seated, silent and serious. "Arya," my boss began in a sharp, controlled tone, "do you realize the damage this has caused? This is completely unprofessional behavior." My throat tightened, and I couldn't muster a single word in my defense. The photograph lay on the desk as irrefutable evidence of my actions, marking the end of any pretense. "I've reviewed the situation," the boss continued, "and neither of you is suited to remain in this role." The words hit me like a blow, stripping away my job, my reputation, and what little dignity I had left. I turned to Vikram, hoping for some support, a word of reassurance, but he remained silent, his head bowed, accepting the verdict without protest. The man who had once made me feel so special now sat there, detached and indifferent, as though our connection had never existed. When the meeting ended, we were told to leave immediately. As I walked out of the office, my legs felt heavy, each step weighed down by shame and regret. Every eye followed me, every whisper stung like a blade. The silence in the office was deafening, more painful than any words could have been. It was as if the walls themselves judged me, and there was no escaping the weight of my actions. Shame weighed heavily on my shoulders as I passed by the crowd of colleagues, head bowed, unable to face their silent judgment. I had become a mere shadow, a source of gossip during their breaks, reduced to whispers and stares. When I arrived home, the atmosphere was stifling, filled with an unmistakable sorrow. Dev sat on the sofa, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on me from the moment I walked in. I froze, bracing myself for the inevitable. He didn't say much. Instead, he handed me a piece of paper, a photograph. I didn't need to examine it closely to recognize it. The same image that had circulated around the office was now in Dev's hands. My heart sank. "Is this why you're always late?" he asked, his voice trembling, each word laced with pain and disappointment. I tried to speak, but my throat was tight, and the excuses I had prepared vanished. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed, as his anguished gaze pierced through me. Finally, unable to bear the weight of his hurt, my legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed, tears streaming down my face. "Dev, I'm so sorry," I sobbed, begging for forgiveness. But his expression had changed. His once compassionate eyes were now lifeless, as though something inside him had broken. Without a word, he stood and walked to the door. I wanted to stop him, to grab his hand and plead with him not to leave, but I couldn't move. Dev, who had been my world, left in silence, taking with him the trust and love I had shattered. As the door closed behind him, the house fell silent. I sat on the floor, tears blurring my vision, overwhelmed by the emptiness and helplessness of my situation. In the following days, I became a ghost of myself, retreating into solitude. Friends who had once been close stopped reaching out. Invitations ceased, and the messages that had once been frequent disappeared entirely. On the rare occasions I saw someone I knew, they avoided me, their smiles replaced by awkwardness or scorn. Even my family was affected. My mother called me one evening, her voice trembling with grief and anger. "Arya, what have you done? Do you know how much shame you've brought upon us?" she cried, each word cutting deeper than the last. My father said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes, his disappointment more painful than words could ever be. The guilt consumed me, knowing that my selfish choices had hurt not just me but everyone I cared about. The rumors and whispers weren't confined to the office or my neighborhood, they spread throughout my community. My family bore the brunt of the fallout, their reputations tarnished because of my actions. Each day was a reminder of my mistakes, the weight of regret pressing down on me. My nights were spent in a small, lonely room, far from the life I once knew. The modest space was barely enough for a bed and a desk, the faint light from the window doing little to dispel the darkness that consumed me. Despite my efforts to rebuild, the damage was done. Job interviews ended abruptly when questions about my past arose, and no one wanted to associate with someone whose name was tied to scandal. Vikram, the man I had risked everything for, disappeared without explanation, leaving me with nothing but bitterness and regret. Dev filed for divorce, and though I couldn't blame him, the pain of losing him was unbearable. Every night I sat alone, haunted by the consequences of my actions. I asked myself over and over why I had thrown it all away, but there was no answer, only sorrow and guilt. I had lost everything, the love of my husband, the respect of my family, and the life I had worked so hard to build. Now I live in quiet isolation, trying to piece together the fragments of my broken existence. The scars left by my choices will never fully heal, serving as a constant reminder of the cost of my mistakes. To anyone listening to my story, I hope it serves as a warning. Hold on to the things that truly matter, and don't let fleeting desires lead you down a path of no return. Thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If my experiences can help even one person avoid a similar fate, then perhaps some good can come from my pain.